Welcome back to another episode of Just
a Squirrel
looking for a nut, trying to get out of this rut.
Savor the flavor, Oleg. Kenny's in the house, and so is Jessica too. How are y'all? You know, I don't know why I'm just talking, who I'm talking to, what I'm talking about. You know, I was just thinking the other day, I've got this like hair gel that's bunched all up in the back of my little do here, and I don't know what to do with it. And I've got some air conditioning that isn't quite working right, and it's hot here in New York City, and I'm feeling nervous and insecure about that. And by the way, I'm mad at that 8th grade teacher who called me a name, and I'm just so disappointed that Kenny is in another city and not in New York City. And I had a conversation with Jessica. I'm just talking to myself. Am I the only one that is annoyed by that? Oh, like you don't ever talk to yourself?
I do. I talk to myself. Yeah, I talk to myself. I talk to strangers too. I think it's an interesting concept. So for me, thinking about, I guess, starting in regard to talking to myself, I think it's healthy to do it. And I know that tomorrow we're going to have another conversation on the Overcoming Outs platform about talking to yourself. But I think in a way, talking to yourself is like talking to a stranger. To a degree.
Well, if yourself is a stranger.
Right? Yeah, that's true. If you're not well acquainted, then yeah, and it's possibly. I think the other thing it's interesting that we're having this conversation because so recently I was thinking about this topic of talking to strangers and the value that it brings. So you and I started off as strangers, right? A year ago?
A year and a quarter ago.
Yeah. And we started with a 15-minute conversation that I think lasted, 2 or 3 hours? Somewhere close to that.
I seem to recall it as like an entire day.
Yeah, it was pretty it was pretty long, but at the same time, it brings up an interesting point, and that is, in that case, we were able to find instant synergy and value from talking to literally a complete stranger across the country. So the point that I'm trying to make is that I think, do I ever talk to strangers? And going back to the initial question, yes, I do. I think over time I have become more selective of the type of strangers that I talk to. I can't say that I talk to anyone anymore, or not everyone anymore, not anyone. And that I don't know why. I think there's maybe a component of history that comes into play, that there's only so much time that I have available in the day, as well as other people. So becoming more strategic and intentional about which strangers do I choose to talk to has become kind of the name of the game.
Well, what about when they talk to you? When I was a little boy growing up in Kansas, they didn't have a lot of bus service on the outskirts of the city, which is where I grew up. So my sister and I would walk from the wheat fields into this suburban shopping mall. That took forever. Then we'd wait a half an hour to catch the bus. Heaven forbid we were 1 minute late and missed the thing. And one time we were late, and we were sitting there just waiting for the next one so we could go to this eye doctor appointment, I think, that we had. And this lady was sitting on the curb there, and she turned around and she started to just chat with us. She talked about how it was her birthday, and she had baked a birthday cake. She was kind of lonely. She didn't have a lot of friends. She wasn't married or with anyone, so she didn't have anyone to celebrate her birthday with except Jesus. So she also decided to put candles on there for her birthday, and as well as one candle on the cake for Jesus's birthday, which wasn't for a while, but she just wanted to celebrate it anyway. And then she blew out the candles, and then she told us about how she had the whole cake. as a way to celebrate her birthday and Jesus's birthday. And this was a long, drawn-out conversation that I engaged in because I was curious and I wanted to know more. I was just like you. I had to know more. I wanted an explanation. And she told us her explanations, and my sister didn't give a bleep, but I did. And then we got onto the bus, and for the rest of my life, at least that day, but it felt like my life, my sister was telling my mother and father relentlessly about this conversation that she had to endure because I felt the need to talk to a stranger and that stranger felt the need to talk to us, and I engaged. So should I have engaged with that person when I decided I wanted to talk to strangers? If someone were to come up to you and talk about baking a birthday cake for themselves and putting one candle on there for Jesus and then eating the whole thing, would you have had the conversation just like I did, or would you have shut her down?
I'm still laughing at how you described it. Your sister had to endure the conversation.
Just like this. Turning her back.
You know, I there's something interesting about it because I find myself in similar situations. So I play basketball here in Austin a couple times
with
a
strangers?
week. With strangers, actually. Yeah, complete strangers. Pretty significant portion of them are people who, I'm trying to think, I don't think I've even hung out with them outside of the basketball court. And not to mention, there are people who come to play with us that are kind of like one and done deals. Yeah. Now, the location of this court, it's in a public park called Gillis Park. And what happens in that court outside of, or in that park outside of the basketball games, is that there's a pretty significant homeless population that lives there. Many of the people I've never met, many of the people I've never had conversations with, but yet what I find myself doing is having similar conversations to what you just described with some of the homeless people that live there. In particular, I think what interests me about any of those conversations is just the perspective that they share about life, considering that they have a very different set of living circumstances than on ones that I go through. So I think there's definitely that curiosity as far as, well, how do you go by X, Y, and Z? How do you make it? How do you make it from one day to the next? Where do you sleep? What do you eat? So I think there's a lot of those unanswered questions, and that's where I think there's significantly higher curiosity compared to, let's say, when I'm talking to a friend of mine and I know where he lives, what he eats, type of thing, especially if it's permanent places that he has or permanent food. So that's one thing. Would I be the type of individual who would have a conversation with someone similar like you did? Probably, to be honest with you. Probably, especially if it's someone that I've never met, because I feel like if anything, that conversation could be a starter to something else, something bigger, something greater than that particular moment. Now, it doesn't always turn out to be the case. Some conversations truly do start with the birthday cake and end with the birthday cake, and that's okay. But I find that in meeting strangers, there's something truly fascinating about it. And maybe it's because I don't know them that well compared to some of my other friends. Like, I don't know if you experienced this, or Jessica or Kenny, but do you ever experience this when you talk to some of your friends, and because you know them so well that sometimes you lose interest in a conversation? Do you ever experience that?
Yes. Oleg, that's honestly, when I look back on those situations years later,
yeah,
that to me has been a sign that the friendship's ending.
Really?
Yeah. That for whatever reason, what kept us interested and engaged with each other has faded away. And so the value and the purpose connected with that friendship is disappearing.
Yeah.
And the friendships that I have had in which there has been some sort of separation have not always been, but have sometimes been predicated with that exact sort of loss of interest in the interim. And honestly, in those situations, sometimes conversations with a stranger is more interesting than the conversation with someone I may have known 20 years.
Yeah. Do you think part of that, because I've been trying to figure out a similar aspect to it, do you think a part of that is because you feel like you know not everything there is to know about the individual, but everything that they choose to disclose? Or is it a shared responsibility as well for you and I to continue to dive into new areas to evolve that friendship, or how does that happen?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Sometimes I suspect it may be that there is only a certain level of depth or of newness that the person has. There are some folks, and I don't judge them for this, it's just a different ethos than I have. They may not be interested in things that I'm interested in at all. Or they may have different values. I was talking to a long-term friend of mine last night about her life versus mine. And she was basically saying to me, well, I've just sort of lived my life day to day. I wish I could do more with it. I wish I could do other things, but I don't have a choice. I have to live my life the way I do. And I wanted to engage a little bit in, well, do you really seriously have no choice? Like, is it really impossible to switch a job that you've been in for 25 years, where you have skills that are in demand, or that are in demand? Is it really this, that, or the other? But she did not want to engage in that depth of conversation until the conversation stopped. No, I had no choice. That's just the way it is. Okay, I chose not to go there because I felt like that was pushing the conversation into an area of unpleasantness and invasiveness that was not what I was seeking in that moment, and I doubt she was either. But if that sort of conversation was one that happened over and over and over again, especially if it was across a multiplicity of subjects, I would say that either the person didn't have the depth to go where I would want the conversation to go and find consistently interesting, or they're choosing not to explore that depth within themselves, which is what I suspect happens as often as not. Other times I've seen, in the interest of maintaining the historicity of the relationship, the conversations devolve into things that are of superficial interest, but ultimately not, as we've said before, quoting Nancy John, transformational. So someone I have known for 30 years, and you and I have discussed this situation before privately and maybe even on air, someone who I was very, very close with for decades, I was noticing that the conversations were increasingly just about like new music that was out, or television shows, or superficial discussions about political gossip. What Donald Trump or George Bush or Michelle Obama or people like that were saying or doing that really weren't substantive. And as I mentioned to you, then later, this person and I began to get into more and more sort of spats. And so that, to me, the lack of interest and the lack of depth and the lack of continued development of mutual interest was a sign that this friendship was not going to serve the same place in our lives that it had previously.
Do you find yourself, is it easier for you to open up about some of these deeper things to a stranger, or is it someone that you have to know for a significant amount of time?
It depends on the vibe I get. I met today for the very first time someone that actually knows you too, Oleg. This person raved about you. And as we talked, maybe it was because you were part of the conversation, or we shared a mutual admiration society with the Oracle Oleg. I felt really safe and comfortable talking about some very, very deep, intense things that had happened in my life. And she shared some really heavy-duty sorts of things. So there was sharing within the first hour of us meeting each other that was really profound. On the other hand, yet earlier today, I met with someone who I've known for years now. And again, this actually happens to be someone that you know as well. And this is someone I like very, very much. But the conversations that she and I have, they're friendly, but they tend to go to business and stay there. What's the vibe?
Yeah, I think the reason why I asked that is because I find it interesting in looking at my life and just how and why I choose to share at any given moment. And I find myself that, once again, depending on the situation, but it's a similar case. I can sometimes, within the first minute of what is said between the two, or however many people are in that group, I can instantly know how deep I'm able to go and what I'm able to reveal, and whether or not I'm going to be accepted or judged or whatever it may be. I'll give you a perfect example. I was recently, I was facilitating this webinar, and at the end, I had opened up to questions and insights and people's perspectives and thoughts about what was presented to them. And essentially what I was talking about was different ways that I've been able to work through unresolved relationships in my life, and how unresolved relationships were an adversity of mine that I had to, quote unquote, overcome or work through. And at the end, I remember there was one person in particular, she didn't agree with how I shared my insights. And so she wanted her experience to be the dominant experience, so to speak. And that's where I found it's an interesting dilemma, because, okay, I can approach that in one or two ways. A, I could continue to match that person's frequency, right? And how it is that they're choosing to present information. Because I think that's one thing, to be able to agree to disagree, like you and I do, and so many other people. I think they're healthy components to that approach. And then I think there is the approach of I'm right and you're wrong. And I think there's a very different atmosphere that gets created. And especially in a situation where I don't know the other individual, I don't know their threshold, I don't know where they're coming from, and I don't know how they're going to accept. That's where I find it to be even more of a challenging dynamic, because then I'm trying to better understand, okay, to what degree do I maintain my own authenticity and honesty about how I'm feeling, and then also just try and respect and, quote unquote, like, be the devil's advocate, like, play out all sides of the story while still respecting their perspective and opinion, while I have no idea who they are, to begin with.
I mean, part of me is like, why? And then there's the other option, which is saying, I have a meeting in 5 minutes. Bye. I mean, I'm at a phase where I'm not into this whole "you're right, you're wrong" sort of thing, unless there's some sort of hierarchical arrangement that I'm in that forces that. And you're right, like someone is, if it's a client of mine and they're paying and they say, I want you to do X, Y, Z, and I give my objection and they say, I want you to do X, Y, Z, they're right, I'm wrong. That's
really
cool.
Though?
It depends. Yes, because they're paying the bills, right? I may, for instance, say I want to have 3 hours talking about blah 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 blah, and they may say, well, I want it for 2 hours. We have to have 1 hour, and I may, again, I'll almost always raise my objection and explain why. But if they're the client and it's their service, I do feel like at the end of the day, if they say, we have 2 hours for X, Y, Z, we have 1 hour for blah, 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 they're right. I may not like it. I'm not going to turn down thousands of dollars for it. And that's cool because I'm delivering a certain. So, since David is gone, my husband, I'm going to tell you a story. He tells me to stop telling these Donna Summer stories. So this will be the last one for now.
Okay.
Donna Summer got, at the height of her fame,
I'll mark your words.
This is being recorded, everyone, to play back. Donna Summer, at the height of her fame, got what was then the biggest recording contract in history with the head of this record label. And the head of this record label said, I want a dance album. I want it to be an opus. I want all of the songs to be dance. I want to be able to push this out as the greatest dance album of the decade. And by the way, I paid you the most money in the history of the music industry to do it. So please deliver. So what does Donna Summer do? She comes back with an album with no dance songs. I really felt that this needed to explore my diversity as a human being. It has new wave, it has pop, it has R&B, and everyone will love it. And I think it's beautiful. Who was right? Who was wrong? Well, I'll tell you who was right and who was wrong. The record executive was, because that album got pulled. It did not end up released. It ended up in the cellar. And so, right, she was wrong. He was right. If someone is paying you millions upon millions of dollars and wants a disco song, for God's sake, give him the disco. Sorry, that's the way it is sometimes. Now, other times, if it's an exchange of information, and then by the way, sometimes other things, you're right and I'm wrong. I may feel that the coronavirus really isn't a virus. It's really a bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. So, right, sometimes these sorts of things happen. If it's just an exchange of ideas in which there's really no objective or subjective underpinning behind it, then I feel like there's more room for these transformational sorts of discussions.
So what if there is? So what if the situation is you are speaking to a group of people, and when you are done, you open it up for a Q&A, and the person says, I disagree with everything that you have said. You should be doing it in X, Y, and Z, which are contrary to what you shared.
Yeah, which happens.
How do you acknowledge the stranger's perspective in a situation like that?
It depends on the situation. If it were a typical corporate sort of training, I may engage in some sort of dialogue with them for a limited amount of time. If it starts to take over the whole Q&A time, yeah, talk to me afterwards. We'll have a conversation. Thank you for raising your point. On the other hand, I was doing a legal training once. Someone who was a stranger who was in the audience, but they were for an agency that I worked for, and I was one of the head lawyers for the whole agency, and this person was not. Said, I disagree with your legal interpretation. I think that the law says X, Y, Z. I think you're wrong. And my response was, when you get yourself to Columbia Law School, graduate, pass the bar, and are appointed to the position that I'm in, where you actually have some basis for thinking whatever little thoughts you have, you can be credibly entertained as someone who might have an opinion that is right or wrong. But I actually know what I'm talking about here. You're wrong. And that was that. Sorry. He may have wanted to have a transformational conversation, for instance, about how this agency was going to interpret those laws. Not his job. He didn't know what he was talking about. He was wrong, and the agency would have backed me up, although it didn't need to. So I do feel like there are different situations where how a stranger responds to you may or may not be transformative. I certainly was not going to be spending all sorts of late nights doing litigation that would have resulted in his, if we had implemented his personal feelings about what the law was, I'm not going to be defending that in court. So I was right.
So if I understand that correctly, it sounds like there can be value in meeting other strangers and having those conversations, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that there is value in meeting strangers and having conversations.
I do agree with that, yes.
I think if anything, does it fall back on a personal choice and how one chooses to like approach that space, whether it's an open mind, open heart, and
well, maybe to me it sometimes depends on the contours of the space too. Here's a weird situation. Now, Kenny, you asked what I'm smoking tonight. You think you started to wonder? Well, wait till you hear what I'm about to tell you. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this situation, what you would have done, Kenny. So I live in New York City. One time after a nice hard workout in the gym during the summer, I walked into the subway. I was drenched in sweat. It was really disgusting. And someone sat down next to me and whipped out a handkerchief and reached over and began to pat my forehead to wipe off the sweat. And then they reached behind and began to wipe the sweat off of my neck. And then said, "You want to chit chat for a while?" And I said, "No." I got up and I left. Why? Because the contours of the situation were such in which I was not interested in engaging in a transformational conversation. And to the extent that any sort of nonverbal conversation had occurred, I didn't want any more of it.
Do you feel like you miss out on opportunities to have transformational conversations with strangers, though, by choosing to create not necessarily assumptions, but a set of expectations about the individual?
It is possible, in all fairness. Now, again, this is the New Yorker in me coming out. The man that spoke to the woman on the bus stop years ago might have felt differently, but I was in Kansas. New York can be realistically a dangerous place. Do you want to have a conversation with strangers here? You may not. And that's just being realistic. People get pushed. People get pushed right on the subway. Let's say someone comes up and wants to chit chat with you, and you're standing on the edge of the subway platform. People get pushed in all the time.
Really?
Yeah. Do you want that? I don't want it. There are scam artists that come up and begin to have conversations with tourists all the time. And while they're chit-chatting away, take their wallet. I don't want that. And so being mindful of personal safety. And again, think about it. I try and be empathetic. If I were a female and a male were to start coming up and talking to her, she may, if he's good looking and seemingly not crazy, conceivably be interested in the conversation, because that might be a way to meet someone. But she also may feel frightened.
Yeah.
What are his intentions? To hurt me?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting dilemma, because I ponder upon that quite often. To what degree do I choose to have the conversations? And to what degree do you choose to protect yourself based on the surroundings that you're in? Especially if it's a city that I've never been to, or just a set of circumstances that I've never experienced. How do you know the difference? How do you know the difference between, okay, this is a time to protect my being and everything that I have, all the different possessions, or this is a time for me to open up and meet a stranger who might turn into who knows what, right? Your best friend, your only friend.
One time, my husband and I were visited by our brother-in-law, and there was a Korean/Japanese buffet that we loved. Unfortunately, it didn't survive the pandemic, but for at least 15, maybe even 20 years, my husband and I would go there with every guest that came into town. If you were ever in New York City, I would have taken... This is in
Manhattan?
It's in Manhattan. It's in Koreatown. And one time when we took my brother-in-law there, we all got our food, and then my husband got up to do a second run down the buffet line. And as I was chatting with my brother-in-law, I looked out of the corner of my eye, and I saw my husband having a chit chat with a stranger who was another male. And let me tell you something. I was up and in that conversation so fast. You couldn't believe it. And the other thing too, that points as to is, and no, my husband wasn't flirting or anything like that. It turns out it was someone that he had known from long ago that I just happened to have never met. But you don't know the mentality of others in the circumstances that you're around.
Yeah.
Right? That man, when he started talking to David, didn't know that David's husband would be looking at this and suddenly seeing a threat to his relationship and being up there ready to find out what was happening. And so that's the other thing why I am somewhat guarded about doing that. You can say something that offends people, or they could be crazy in a dangerous way. And right, like, do I really want to subject myself to that?
I used to find that to be challenging. I used to do that quite a bit when I was in relationships, and I would see my significant other talking to a stranger, or even if it was someone that I knew or I knew of, I found the same exact thing. I think jealousy for me has been something that I'm probably working on, even as we speak, different components of it. Because you're right, there is something to those situations, which I think is very much in line with what life is, and that's the component of the unknown. You truly don't know what may happen the next minute, the next hour, not necessarily to you, but to your relationship, to the other individual, to their desires, to what they want to pursue and what they don't want to pursue or engage in.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably, at least how I have understood it, it's only natural to have those feelings. It's only natural to have those feelings of attachment. I personally don't know if there's a way to live without a sense of attachment, whether it's attachment to the physical place or some sense of connection that's able to be created through the stranger connections, so to speak. Right. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that is something that exists or if that's more of just a fantasy of mine that I wish it did.
Kenny doesn't believe that you would ever be jealous.
Of course. No, I have moments like that without a doubt. I think the other component to jealousy that I will address kind of from my own experience is I've realized that much of it also has to do with the level of connection that I have with the other person. For example, if I don't have as close of a connection with you, then I think that level of jealousy, it's almost non-existent. But if I really feel like I share a lot with you as an individual, then those moments that you described in seeing your husband talk to a stranger, and then meanwhile there's everything boiling on the inside of you trying to figure out, hey, should I be protective and should I end this conversation? What should I do? Do I need to, assert myself to let them know that there is a husband in the picture?
Yeah.
I think those are real feelings. And I've also realized that there's and we spoke about this many hours before, but this concept of being able to reframe some of those situations, right? Even in your case, like taking a step back and say, hey, it's probably not what's happening. It probably is just a friendly exchange for X, Y, and Z, but yet you can't help yourself but to have some other thoughts come up. I've realized that the challenge of being able to reframe situations is that even though there is value in being able to look at the same exact event through multiple perspectives, I also find it that sometimes that doesn't create the opportunity to feel what it is that you need to feel or feel what it is that you're actually feeling.
Yeah.
There is a real feeling behind the concept of jealousy.
Yeah. Just as there is a real feeling behind fear, but there's also the real tendency to discount possibility and opportunity, which is what you were talking about, having a conversation with a stranger that could end up creating a new friendship. And like you said in passing, but I think really deserves some underscore, which is it could be that person's only friend. You may be the only person who heard or listened to what that stranger had to say during a period of time.
And you may be I don't know how often this happens, but I'm sure it's got to happen. You might be the last person that can create that opportunity for them to be a friend before they choose to do something that they can never come back from. In fact, the more that I think about my own friends and the people that I have had some time in between within those friendships, they've come in the most random situations, encounters, meeting complete strangers, I'll give you a couple examples. One, this is a friendship that I had with a person. Him and I have been friends for 16 years, going on to 17 years, met on the soccer field. Just didn't know each other. I didn't even speak English at the time. And somehow, one way or another, something clicked. Next thing I know is this is a person that him and I were playing sports and 17 years later, we live halfway across the country, and yet we still choose to keep in touch on a daily basis.
Amazing.
You know?
And Mary Jenkins says she expects to meet someone new every day.
I would be curious to hear from Mary, what is, like, does she put expectations on that, and what's the value that she chooses to, what's the value that you choose to assign to that? Like, do you hope to gain something from that encounter? Is it learn about yourself? Like, what's the intention?
I want to know, Mary, do you expect to like everyone that you meet every day?
Yeah, that's a different story. But that's a real story.
It is, because we can't like everybody.
Just like not everyone likes you.
Yeah.
Not you, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you and me.
I don't even like me
Kenny.
sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know why everyone else. I hate me. I don't know why any of you think you should like me.
But it's an interesting one, because I think kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, and it's that concept of having a set of expectations. I used to have these expectations that everyone I met, especially all the strangers that I met, I wanted to turn them into best friends. Yeah. I remember there was a phase of my life where I would, and this was recently, it probably still is to a degree, where I was trying to turn every single connection I come across into a transformational relationship. Yeah. And that's just not a thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's some of them truly are not, I don't know if it's necessarily not possible. It's just that you're at different chapters of your life.
Yeah.
And I think there is a lot of truth to be said about not everyone wants what you want.
Yeah.
So not every one of your dreams is a stranger's dream, so to speak.
I'm so glad you raised that, Oleg.
Mm-hmm.
Like you, I went through a large part of my life wanting every possibility that was within a new relationship to become maximally fulfilled.
Yeah.
And to have these deep relationships with everyone that I developed, even a shallow relationship with, or coworkers or things like that. If we went out for drinks once, I really wanted that to, if the conversation went well at all, I wanted it to develop into something deeper. And it was heartbreaking for me how many times people just didn't have the same agenda. Sometimes they just wanted a shallow friend that they could hang out with. Sometimes they just wanted a drink that night, but their lives were too busy, or they had other priorities or whatever to develop a deeper relationship with me. Sometimes there have been people that have just disappeared from my life, and this happens to everyone, not just me. They just sort of vanish. You lose touch with them. And the narrative that I used to create for myself around that was that somehow I had failed as a friend, or I was somehow not interesting enough or not valuable enough, when really it may have had nothing to do with me whatsoever. And I'm actually glad that that doesn't happen. I'm glad that that wish of mine, as much as I might want to manifest it, didn't come true. Because realistically, especially for someone like me who's extremely outgoing, and Oleg, you're outgoing too. If we had deep, long-term, sustainable friendships with every person that we talk to, how would we even have time to eat?
Do you ever feel, I don't know if bad is the right word, but maybe not completely fulfilled or whole in living with that reality, the fact that not every single encounter is going to transform into a transformational or a deep relationship, or even those that you do encounter, whether it's over a beer or at a whatever baseball game, whatever it might be, Zoom call, and you just feel this burst of energy and synergy between the two, but yet due to either your inactions or the other person's inactions or whatever it may be, that friendship or connection never goes beyond that initial conversation. Do you ever feel sad about that form of reality taking place? Or how do you process that?
Sometimes I feel sad. Sometimes I have wondered, was I conned? is the person good at creating the feeling of connection when truly they don't feel it at all? A lot of politicians are known for that. People who met Bill Clinton, for instance, would say, oh my gosh, I felt like I was the only person in the room when he was talking to me. He was solely and only focused on me. It was rapturous. I felt like I had met a best friend for life. He didn't give a shit about, he didn't give a darn about them. He wanted their votes. So I guess he gave a limited degree of, had a limited degree of concern about them. But it's impossible to believe that Bill Clinton has wanted to have a transformational relationship with every single person that he meets as the president of the United States for 8 years. It's just impossible for that to be true. So when that happens, sometimes I feel conned, or maybe that they were doing it for an ulterior motive and they may have had the gift of charisma or have developed that as a skill. Other times I have felt neutrally about it, like, well, I really like them and it could have been transformational, but I wasn't so blown away that I feel disappointed by it. And then other times I have sensed that it probably is that they did not like me as much as I've liked them. If there's any whiff I get of that, that's cool. As I've said before, sometimes I'm okay with being not liked. That's fine, especially if you're someone that I would have hated. But no, I don't hate people. But right, if you're someone whose values don't reflect what I like, if you're someone that believes in murdering puppies for no reason and you hate me because I believe in preserving the life of innocent puppies, hate me all you want, please. Mary says, by the way, not everyone will like her, but she will show respect, appreciation, and love to everyone she encounters. That is amazing. And thank you for being so thoughtful and insightful. Am I able to do that all the time? Are you able to do that all the time, Oleg? That's like so amazing. I aspire to that.
It's a good question. I think I'm the same way. I think I aspire to do that. Do I get it right all the time? Probably not. And I think because one of the reasons why I'm not able to do it is that there's so many different factors that impact my day-to-day.
Yeah.
So being able to be in a state where all three of those are present for every single encounter, in my opinion, and just based my experience, that's not something that's possible for me. So I've accepted that as a reality, that there's going to be days where I have whatever disagreement or some sort of conflict before I have a 15-minute call or a podcast or whatever it is. And it's going to impact how I show up. Now, throughout that conversation, I might change and I might get to the point where those three things will become evident, but I can't say that I do that every time. And I think part of the reason is because maybe I don't have the perspective to making those three things so important in my life, where those are the things that I ultimately go from. You know, like in Mary's case, I think having the experience that she's had, it has a different perspective, which probably shifted her own priorities. You know, I don't want to put words into your mouth, Mary, but it sounds like it might have done that. For me, when I choose to look at that question of what's important to me, I think there's a variety of things, and I think depending on the conversation, those things shift. But if I had an experience such as the one you had or so many other people, maybe there would be more of a permanency within the things that I would seek out and choose to show up as every single time.
As I'm processing the two statements that Mary Jenkins said, I've got to acknowledge that she's exposed, at least in my thinking, a real limitation. In my mind, for instance, I was thinking if the person was a total jerk to me, particularly if it was someone who was a jerk to me over and over again, when I'm interacting with them, and am I truly going to be grateful or appreciative, as she put it?
Yeah.
am I really going to feel like I need to show them respect? I actually do try and show people respect. I don't always succeed in that regard either.
Yeah.
Appreciation, though, was the stumbling block for me. If I meet someone and they are just a total monster, at least in my perception, am I going to be grateful? But as I'm pondering what Mary said, the limitation in my thinking that was exposed by her is perhaps I'm not looking at things from a bird's eye view in the way that she, having gone through what she's been through in her life, may be willing to do, which is that you can learn from those people. The person that was a monster to me may remind me of how I don't want to be.
Yeah.
Or may put a mirror on my own behavior. Or it may give me an example of what someone's life or situation can be like if they're suffering or in a bad place in their journey, and open doors to compassion for me. So I do want to say briefly, Mary, thank you so much for those remarks. Really, really thought-provoking and triggering in the best possible way, at least for this guy.
The thing that it triggered within me is this concept of the problem is you. And I think even in what you were describing, the situation where you might meet someone who, according to your own set of metrics or standards, appears to be in misalignment with how you view life. The reason why I think it reminded me of the concept the problem is you is because it still boils down to your perception of how you view that situation, as well as the individual and what you choose to do with it and how you choose to respond. So in understanding, this is something I'm trying to work on as consciously as I can. And once again, I don't get it right every time, but understanding that truly in every single situation, the problem is me. Even if this person, going back to the conversation, doesn't view life or the importance of life, whether it's animals or whatever, whoever it may be, the same exact way that I do, the problem is still me. And what I can do in that moment is that I can choose whether I engage with that person or I disconnect and don't engage. Now I do the fine, I don't know if it's necessarily a fine line, but maybe it's a responsibility or something like that. But let's say if it's something that is a universal topic, I can't really think of what that might be, but let's say life is one of them, for example, right? It's universally accepted across everyone that life is important, therefore we shouldn't take away lives. So what is the responsibility that I carry in a conversation with a stranger about a topic like that, and to what degree do I try and influence their thinking in order for them to change their perspective and start to see the importance of not only human life, but all life. So that's where I find more of a tricky situation for me, because yes, even though you view it one way and I view it another way, and really the problem is me because I'm the one experiencing discomfort, you might not be. So I'm the one that having to do it. But at the same time, it's like, okay, do I just stop the conversation here, go to the journal, deal with my discomfort, while also knowing that you're going to continue on within your day, not viewing the importance of life? Does that make sense?
It
What's
does.
the line that how do you proceed? And I don't expect an ultimate answer or anything. It's just something that's been interesting to me. It's like, what's the lesson within that particular engagement?
I will share a true story involving someone I know. I will leave out many details and change some. Once you hear the story, you'll understand why. I will also predicate this story by saying that what I'm about to share is an example of a conversation with a stranger in which the two strangers had dramatically different worldviews about the value of life.
Mm-hmm.
And really, to what extent there is true, I'm pushing back a little bit, Oleg, on you.
Yeah.
Not wholeheartedly, but
right.
Respectfully.
Right.
because it pushes the boundary of the idea that if there is not a transformational relationship, or if there is discomfort in the conversation, that it really is because of you.
Right.
Someone I know was in a bar one time. It was a female. And she was having drinks. And a man engaged in a conversation with her, sitting next to her. And as they began to talk, he began to tell her about some personal issues that he had had with other men, some challenges in his relationships with other men. And he began to describe some behaviors that he had engaged in with these people that he had met in various ways in his life to her. And she felt very disturbed by what he told her. I will admit, this conversation was almost certainly transformational, but it was also transactional. It was transformational in a way that I don't think that we commonly think about transformation, perhaps, but it was transformational. She disagreed with his worldview, as well as how he handles his disagreements with other men, and left the bar with another male by her side who she didn't know, but she asked him to leave with her. She later went to the police to talk about this situation and found out that she was the only person that they have encountered who has had a conversation of the nature that she had with this individual she met at a bar and survived, because he was a serial killer. And that's a situation where I raise it. It's a dark story. It's disturbing and it's scary. But it also goes as to, really, was the problem her?
Yeah.
And if that is a situation in which the problem is not her, and I will argue pretty forcefully, and I think few people would disagree, that someone else's view of life when they're a serial killer is not right, like that disagreement, and you not being her not being able to or willing to engage in a conversation about whether serial murder is appropriate behavior. Right. That's not something I think that many people could. I don't know that I would have the competency to talk a serial killer out of mass murders. So if that, in that extreme case, the ability to have a meaningful conversation, to express gratitude for the interaction, to feel like, well, whatever possibility could have been not happening was on me, isn't really fair. Unless we're considering these possible potential outcomes of a conversation to be murder of you as a person. And so if that's the case, then what are other situations, again, sort of pulling it in a little bit to situations that are less and less extreme, where does that dividing line go?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think it's the same exact question that I would maybe approach if someone were to tell you that they murdered someone. What do you do?
I had someone tell me that once, by the way.
Is the problem truly you because of the discomfort you're experiencing in hearing something like that? Or is the problem
that they killed somebody?
Yeah. So I think there probably are situations. I don't think there's anything that is kind of the ultimate rule, so to speak, but there probably are situations that go outside of that. That problem is you concept. But I will say that I can't even say that anymore. I think even in most moments of conflict, the problem is not always you. Because what you had described as far as your story goes, that's a moment of conflict. What do I do? Do I go tell the police? Do I keep it to myself? Do I tell my friend? Do I not tell my friend? Do I tell my parents?
Yeah.
Or do I not tell anyone? So there's still conflict, but at the same time, I mean, I guess you could say theoretically the problem is still you, because you still have to choose to solve that problem. And that's, what do you do? What is the solution to that problem, right? Who do I tell, and how much do I tell? So it's just fascinating how, going back to Mary's point, every situation truly does, I can't say it truly does, I think it has the potential for a lesson to be learned. I think for me, what I've learned about my own experience is that it took me a significant amount of time to be able to understand the lessons and takeaways, and also ask questions in a way that can surface those lessons and takeaways from the conversations. I didn't always see those. I didn't always see lessons and takeaways from every conversation, especially conversations where I was in complete disagreement in. I didn't see the lesson that I had to learn in that.
Yeah, that's something that I wonder. I'm thinking about when the person I know told me, they said, don't ever kill someone, Scott. You won't like it. It's not a good feeling. I don't know that was a lesson that I needed to learn.
Yeah.
Maybe I did. It had occurred to me before that I might feel kind of awful if I murdered someone. It also had occurred to me that if I kill someone, they might feel awful too.
Yeah.
At least in those moments before their life ended. The lesson that if it had been me that had a conversation with someone that quickly turned very disturbing, and I then later found out they were a serial killer.
Yeah.
Right. What was the lesson I would have learned? I guess it probably would have been to follow my gut and get the heck out. She learned she should do that. Maybe I would have. The other thing too is the lesson that we learn. Are those really the lessons? Are there lessons merely that we're choosing to learn? Are they actual lessons? Are they
That's a great question.
merely things, that we just make up and say it's a lesson? Like her lesson conceivably could have been, don't go to bars alone.
Yeah.
But is that really a fair lesson to learn from that? If that had been and that might have been the conclusion I would have had. Or
but
you never talk to a man again, right? Like,
you're assuming that every single bar you go to from that point on, you're going to meet
a serial killer.
A serial killer, where the probability of that, I don't know what the probability is.
Yeah,
it could be high, it could be
minuscule.
Low. Right?
Thank goodness. Yeah.
But at the same time, I think you raise a really interesting point, because to what degree is it the lesson that you choose to learn, and to what degree is it the ultimate lesson? Because if you also think about, well, I'm not going to project my meaning onto you, but for me, let's say, for example, I've learned one lesson from a particular situation. Then I have a conversation with a complete stranger who doesn't know me, and I share that experience with them. And then they say something, or they ask me a question that allows me to see that situation I described to them through a different lens. Now I've uncovered the other lesson within that, or even a deeper or a more meaningful lesson. So that's where it becomes a little bit more blurry as far as what is the ultimate thing. And if anything, is it simply an aspiration that in finding the ultimate thing, then I can find that sense of peace of mind, and I no longer have to look for lessons from that given situation. Maybe that's just the way the mind copes with it. Because if you think about it, like if there is no end point to it, you would constantly be searching for that ultimate answer. Or you would be searching for multiple answers. So then the question becomes is, where do you stop? Do you stop? Does your mind ever stop? Or do all of these experiences and encounters truly have no endpoint, and the only endpoint there is the one that we choose?
On the subject of talking to strangers and lessons.
Yeah.
I wonder if sometimes too there can be lessons that you learn that can only be taught by strangers.
Yes.
And that as a stranger, you're uniquely positioned to say. Just last night, I got together with a very long-term friend of mine who is a woman of color. And she and I went to Whole Foods together to get some some snacks for a picnic we were having. And as she was called, as a little buzzer came up for her to go up to the cash register, a white woman barged in front of her and took over that spot. And my friend said, I was the next in line. You are not in, basically she said, you were not in line here. You can't just come here and bump in front of me. And the woman said to her, the white woman said to her, I'm busy. I was in a rush. So the cashier sent the woman of color who had been pushed out of her way by a white woman who didn't know whether my friend was in a rush or not to another register. She did not for a single second say to Miss Thing, who decided that she was entitled to that particular spot, even though she was not in line, it was not her time. She didn't tell her to get back in line.
Yeah.
And so this stranger who happened to observe the whole thing, named Scott Mason, decided to use that as a teaching moment for the cashier. And when she told me that, yes, this person had come up and pushed my friend out of the way, she said, well, I sent your friend over to the other side of the store so she could get help there. And I told her that was not an acceptable solution. And I made it clear in no uncertain terms that this was observed, this was a dynamic, this where there was another solution, and that her solution had sent a message that I had a problem with. And this person had nothing to say. She better not have, because there was nothing to say. And so I think that that was a situation where I, as a stranger, was uniquely positioned to offer the opportunity for a lesson to be taken. And her body language and the response that she gave to me made it clear that she at least had heard, as to whether she agreed or not, she had heard this. At a minimum, that she had sent a very strong optical message, a very strong one, and a very strong customer service message as well. And so I think that there have been times in which I have been told things by strangers that were uncomfortable or difficult, or that may have reflected on my behavior that I might not have even been willing to hear from my husband. And that can be the power and transformational push that can occur through a conversation with a stranger. That is, to me, the true potential scope of opportunity that it presents, even beyond a relationship. It's possible that if I had been that cashier and I had decided to let this thing happen, and someone had the remarks to me about it that I had in my observation of this, I certainly would have I certainly would have left transformed.
I think one of the reasons why that may take place, because I've experienced similar situations where, let's say, I would bump into a stranger and then they don't know me, they don't know what I do or anything about me. And through the brief encounter, they just happen to be so that is so true, because it might be a direct reflection of what I might be feeling or experiencing. And what I've realized is that I think one of the things that makes such encounters possible and so transformative, so to speak, is because there is either very little or perhaps no attachment to you as an individual. I think one of the reasons why things like that don't take place, for example, in many of the friendships or connections that I'm a part of, is because there's a level of attachment where feelings become so great, the feeling of not wanting to disappoint you if I tell you what I believe is the truth, the fear of possibly losing you as a connection, the fear of being rejected, the not acceptance, the lack of belonging, all those things are real situations. And I think those things come from attachment to the individual. So the point of what I'm sharing is, I think in certain situations, what I've experienced is talking to strangers is healthy because it creates those opportunities where not necessarily the ultimate truth, but a pretty close layer to that ultimate truth is exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't know you.
Mm-hmm.
They don't care about whether you reject them or whatever it is, because what are the chances that you're going to see that person at that grocery store again?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially if this is your first and only time stopping at that grocery store. What if you just happen to be traveling from New York to Texas and you're on a road trip and you had to take a detour route than your regular one? So I think there's something to be said about that. I think there's something to be said about there is that possibility for a lesson to be learned. Whether or not that lesson is accepted, I don't choose to.
Yeah.
It would be nice, but I don't choose to attach to it.
Yeah.
You could just brush it off. You could say F this person and move on. Same
Yeah.
way that cashier, right? She could have given you the courtesy of her time and just given you the ability to be heard, and that's it.
Yeah.
There wasn't necessarily that she had to commit to action afterwards.
Totally.
So I think that that's where I find the value, is that there are certain situations that strangers do create that some of the closer people within one circle, I don't know if it's not able to, but I think it's because of all those things that we talked about, the fear of possibly losing you as a friend, as a family member, or whatever it may be. It prevents those conversations from happening, which is fortunate and unfortunate at the same exact time, right?
Yeah.
And then it also brings up, I think, another question, and that is, in thinking about strangers and in thinking about people closest to you, are there certain things that you simply do not want to hear from someone close to you that you would rather hear from a stranger, and vice versa?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there are some things. Sometimes I have heard it so much from David, that my husband, that I just don't take it seriously anymore. And then the stranger says it and invalidates it.
Or it could become just detrimental.
Yeah.
Like if I tell you that you are full of fill in the blank, and if it's my first time acknowledging it, and you and I have this connection, you're probably going to receive that differently if it's someone who's passing you on the street and says the same exact thing.
Yeah.
Even though there might be truth to that.
Yep. And right in the level of vulnerability, sometimes with David, because I love him and I care about him so much and I respect his opinion to such an extent.
Yeah.
If he says something to me, I'm going to take it to heart very deeply. And like there are those times when I just ignore it. And then there's other times when I really will take it to heart in a way that I wouldn't with anyone else. Whereas a stranger, it might be flippant and I might not care, but I could still hear it. It depends on the situation and what it is. There was someone that my husband and I were friends with for a while, who, for instance, would love to tell us, you should tell the other person, blah, 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 blah. You should tell David this, Scott, or David, you need to let Scott know that blah, blah, blah. And they would always be things that were pointed and hurtful. And after a while, we understood that this person's intentions weren't necessarily the best. And that this person had issues of their own and challenges that they were dealing with. And so there was limited stock we should put. And then there was a question of, hey, why are we, excuse me, even repeating, like, why do we even care what this person has to say?
Yeah.
Well, why can't they just tell David or Scott this themselves? And so that sort of background noise, or the absence thereof, can play into whether or not I can hear something from a stranger versus someone that I really care about.
Yeah. Do you find yourself to be less or more honest with a stranger compared to someone that you have a connection with?
Depends on the nature of the connection.
Mm-hmm.
I tended to work for very narcissistic bosses until the very end, which I would tell people when I interviewed with them, I'm always going to be honest with you. But earlier in my career, when I was less confident, I wasn't.
Why do we say that? I say the same thing. I got to be honest with you, as if I'm not going to be honest. Or does it create like an additional meaning to what I'm about to say? Like I've been trying to understand that on my own, because I say the same exact thing. And then I literally afterwards question, it's like, why did I say that?
Because we do lie sometimes. We do. Or we soften things and say things in a way that obscures their meaning in a way, or that obscures the directness of the communication, and we're afraid of hurting the other person's feelings.
Yeah.
Or, so I had a boss who was notoriously sweet. She would say something sweet to you and you'd wonder why you were crying 3 hours later. So
that was transformational.
Yes, she was transformational. I'll tell you that. And when I first started working there would be these big senior team meetings that I would be at, and she would ask people questions. And so one time she said something or another, and she turned to me very sweetly and with an angelic smile and a chirpy little voice, said, "What do you think about this, Scott Mason?" And this was the first time that I had been called on in any of her meetings, but I had sensed that she was very narcissistic. So I went with my gut and I just repeated back what she said in more sophisticated language and thought let her know how brilliant I thought it was. Because I had nothing to say. I didn't even have an opinion. I didn't know. I was too new. And so then later I asked my staff who were there, how did that go? I feel a little bit insecure. And they told me, oh, you answered it beautifully. She loves people who agree with her. So I wasn't honest with her. I learned, oh yeah, just agree with her. Whatever she says, just say, yeah, that's how you get ahead here. So I wasn't honest with her. Sorry. I liked having my paycheck at that point in my life. But other times I would have bosses where I would say, I have to be honest with you, because they were so used to having people behave in a way that was sycophantic. And I did not want to be perceived that way as I matured.
The only reason why I asked that is because as I was thinking about my own experience and situations where I say I have to be honest with you, I really started to question something actually Casey had pointed out a couple of times throughout the conversations I've had with him. And he said that words are inexact. And I agree with that statement. I think that so often, whatever I might be feeling or however it is that I'm feeling about a particular situation, I lack the language to fully express what it is that I'm going through. So being able to use my language to tell that, I think using some of these statements such as I'm going to be honest with you, it adds an additional meaning to it. And I think if anything, it probably also creates the possibility for that statement to not be disregarded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
If I tell you, if I'm going to be honest with you, you're most likely to be full attention on me and what I'm about to say, compared to just saying it along with thousands of other sentences that I'm going to use. Right?
I'm looking at Kenny's last few sets of remarks.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, A, something tells me Kenny has no problem using very precise language. B, Kenny, do you ever tell people I'm going to be honest with you or to be honest with you? Or do you just say it, snap your fingers, and move on? That's how I sort of imagine.
Do you think it's possible to be fully honest in every given situation?
No, not in every situation.
Even in most. I mean, what is most?
Yeah, what is most? I don't know.
50% of the time?
Like, what if someone, like the famous question, if your significant other asked you, does this make me look heavy?
Yeah.
Right. Are you really going to be honest?
Yeah.
So for those of you not from New York City, and I don't mean to be New York City centric here, it's just that the examples that I'm coming up with relate to things that are specific to this location. In the subway, people I saw your response, Kenny. We're both sort of laughing. I knew that would be the answer. In the subway, it's considered polite, although not everyone is. It's considered polite to stand up if someone is, and give a seat if someone is pregnant, disabled, or extremely elderly and frail. Well, okay. And so one time, but you also want to preserve the person's dignity. Like if they're old, they may not want to be reminded that they're elderly. And so you sometimes ask, do they want a seat?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a young looking woman that got into the subway with her best friend. And I looked at her and I said, would you like, and not her friend. And I looked at her and I said, would you like a seat, ma'am? And she said no. And her friend went,
yeah.
And I felt horrible.
You thought she was pregnant?
Yes, I did. And I don't think she appreciated what was clearly the implication behind my question. And her friend giggling and saying, oops, in that like catty sort of way, probably didn't help the whole thing at all. And so the question was embedded in there was an implicit statement behind the question.
Right.
Which was that you look like you're pregnant. That was being honest in a way I wish I hadn't been, looking back on it, even though I kind of don't really hold myself that responsible for the part of me that's empathetic. You know, people have a lot of feeling states around their bodies, and people get judged for having body types of a certain look. And there I was making that assumption and making a question that was really a hidden statement. Yeah. And she got ridiculed by her friend on the spot.
Yeah. But so that example, in my opinion, going back to the problem is you, I think that is more closely related to it. And here's why. Once again, just one opinion, not the opinion. I could interpret that, yes, you might have felt that she was pregnant and needed a seat or whatever it was. But at the same time, someone else looking at the situation could have interpreted that 50 different ways. It's a female, that I do that I find myself doing that more depending on the gender. Like I'll still do it for anyone that is, appears to be older or pregnant or some of these other situations. But I also I'll do it if it's a female standing up, regardless of what the age might be. And I just, for me, like that's the common courtesy, So I feel like because there are multiple storylines that could be attached to it, that's where it becomes a little bit harder to understand, well, what if she interpreted that differently? Now, there are certain situations where I feel like exactly how it was interpreted, and it could have been like that. Mm-hmm. It could have for sure been one of those where she interpreted it exactly as you were thinking it. Mm-hmm. But I've also been in situations where I made certain assumptions and the person either just brushed it off or they actually found tremendous value in that, mm-hmm. even though they weren't pregnant or they didn't have bad knees or, all these other things that might require additional service or assistance. So that's where I find interesting. Once again, it goes back to assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Kenny says you're a true gentleman.
I truly am. I try to be one.
That's the lens through which you see yourself and Kenny too, but there are a lot of other stories, Oleg.
There are. I'm sure there are. No, but it's a fact. Like it's a fact of life. You and I can do the same exact thing, just like you and I can look at the same exact bottle, and I know there's water in there, but I know Kenny thinks that there's something else in there. So who's right? Who's wrong? Right?
Do you think that the fact that you are a gentleman and I'm this crass hooligan impacts our ability to successfully engage with strangers?
Yes. I think in my case, it creates more of an open environment to have possible conversations. I think in the other case, it may not, because of the assumptions that could be created from the other end, the stranger's point of view. I think appearance also probably plays a role, right? If you are
6'1" with broad shoulders, a beard, curly hair, and a loud mouth.
Yeah. I mean, I think that could possibly impact whether or not I choose to have a conversation with you based on previous experiences. You know what I mean?
Is that why nobody talks to me anymore?
If I was so going back to your bar story, right? If I was attacked by an individual who is 6'1", broad shoulders, curly hair, and every time I see an individual like that, I constantly get triggered. What are the chances that I'm going to go up to you, especially if the attack happened more than one time, right? What are the chances that I'm going to go up to you and strike a conversation in knowing my previous history? 0 to none.
Yeah, one could say it depends on how willing you are to set aside your generalizations. Another person might say it depends on how stupid you are.
Exactly. So, but that's what brings up the good point. It's just like you never know, and not every stranger is the same. And even though certain things do happen in life, for example, if you get in a car crash, what are you going to do? Never drive a car? If you fall off your bicycle, are you never going to ride a bike again? You know, if you trip over a banana peel, are you never going to take a walk outside? There are all of these extreme but rather real situations that probably happen on a daily basis for some people, as well as all of us that are part of this call included. So then the question is, how do you proceed? How do you respond to those circumstances? And also, how do you differentiate between the fact that certain things truly are circumstantial, and then there might be certain things that are permanent, so to speak? Is there anything that's permanent? Is every 6'1", curly hair, broad shoulder individual someone that's bound to attack you? Probably not, right?
I hope not. In a bad state of affairs.
Yeah. Then your possibility of talking to strangers will be significantly lower, if that's the case.
Kenny calls us comedians. Kenny. Kenny. Are you projecting a little bit?
He's selling tickets.
Oleg, we've talked about so much today. We have brought up the usual theme of transformational conversations, and I know that some of the things that Mary and Kenny and Jessica have shared have been transformational for me, as well as really just made the whole show a good time. So I want to thank y'all for that so much. How can people have some more transformational interactions with the one and only Oleg?
For me, one way people can do that is through a show that I host called Overcoming Odds tomorrow, as well as every single Friday from that point forward. We have conversations that take place at 10:45 a.m. Central Time that you can join through either a platform like this, Facebook or LinkedIn. I know that the topic tomorrow will be, do you talk to yourself? So slightly different than stranger, maybe not.
As you made clear at the beginning of this show.
Right?
I love you, brother.
Maybe there's some similarity, but that's one place. The other place is called The Power of Your Story, which is a similar platform where one gets the chance to explore the stories they create. Everything that I think we touched upon today is built on a story. What's the story that I'm telling about any given set of circumstances, and how true is that story? And if it's not the full thing that's true, what is the truth? So those are two spaces that people can connect with me and have those conversations. But at the same time, I know that there are other opportunities where people can have strangers can have conversations with you, which can hopefully become friends in some of these transformational relationships. But I'll give you that chance to talk to strangers and tell them where they can hopefully transform those strange connections into lifelong friendships.
Well, and I know for a fact that people who have participated in this show have connected with each other off the show and had transformational impacts on each other's lives. And it is a beautiful thing. So, Scott Mason's Purpose Highway is where you can find out and hear more from your homie Mason here. PurposeHighway.com. For 2 more episodes, it will be telling the stories of influencers and individuals who have connected to a higher purpose to connect to a better self and a better world. Actually, it's one more person with a 2-part episode that is so powerful. If you are listening to this or if you're watching this and you hear it, you have got to check it out. So check us out today, but be sure to come back next Wednesday for the first of a 2-part season finale that will, it's intense, but it is powerful and it is deep. Season 2 will begin shortly after that. And the theme there will be about finding connection through meaning. We all have the need for connection. We all have the need for meaning. How do they intersect in a world that's dramatically changing? That's season 2 of Purpose Highway starting in 3 weeks. Oleg, talk to us about what you're scrolling beneath our gorgeous little faces here.
Well, in regard to connection, in regard to talking to strangers, I know that you and I started this platform and this space for other people to be able to engage in as a strange encounter. Not a strange encounter, but as an encounter that was shared by 2 strangers once upon a time. And if anything, what I've learned is that through commitment and connection, we've been able to foster that connection, so to speak, and really build off of it. So for anyone that I think has enjoyed this show and found value within it, I know it would help us tremendously if you chose to leave a review on Facebook or LinkedIn so that other strangers can stumble upon this show and stumble upon the conversations that we choose to have. And that is something that is important to me in being able to create similar spaces like that.
And that reminds me, Kenny, Jessica, Mary, anyone else who sees or listens to this at any point in the future, don't hesitate to forward the post that you found this on to your own network and friends, because we want other folks to join in with you and participate in the conversations and share their own thoughts and perspectives so that all of our minds can get blown.
I think there's something to be said about the power of the collective.
Yes.
Even though the conversation starts with 2 individuals, it ends with 2 individuals unless other people choose to be a part of it.
And it's happened again tonight. Thanks, everyone, for this.